Hi, everyone, and welcome to Look Up with Kelly Bell. And I am so honored to have Scott Davis with us today. And as you can see, we have a statue of Pat Garrett and we have several books on Pat Garrett. And I am very excited to introduce you to the great grandson of Pat Garrett, who has spent his life, one of his side hustles, one of his passions is researching the real story, the real story about the great man, Pat Garrett. There was a whole lot more to Pat Garrett than being a sheriff.
Yes, yes, very much.
So I'm going to turn it over to Scott Davis.
Thank you, Kelly. So thankful for the time to spend. It's as Kelly mentioned, Pat Garrett really had a very fascinating life. He's most attached to Billy the capturing and killing Billy the Kid, but there was so much more to his life. But to start out, I'm a direct descendant. Pat Garrett had 8 children, and I came from number 7. My grandfather, his son, was Oscar Loman Garrett, and then my mother was Virginia Lee Garrett, and then my mother married my dad, who was a Davis. So that's how the jump from Garrett to Davis. But yeah, I'm the great grandson of Pat Garrett. So Pat Garrett was born in Casita, Alabama, which is on the Alabama-Georgia border. And he was the second of 8 children. His parents had 8 kids, and both of his parents were from Georgia. So they just came across the state line, and they lived there until Pat was 3. And then the family loaded up, and they had family in Claiborne Parish in Louisiana, which is near a small town called Homer, Louisiana, just on the very north end of Louisiana, just not far from Arkansas. But there was some property there, and my great grandfather, and great grandmother, they moved there when Pat was just 3 years old. And he lived there until both his parents passed away at a fairly young age. But Pat this would have been after the war, after the Civil War. Pat was born in 1850, and so moved to Louisiana in 1853, and then moved was there in Louisiana during the Civil War. The war took its toll on the family and the property that they owned. And his parents, again, they had 8 children. It is believed that his mother passed away after giving birth to the 8th child. And then his father had fallen on financial hard times, lost his wife, and within a year, he had passed away. And so both of my great grandparents are buried there in Louisiana. But Pat, he was the second of oldest. Older sister, her name was Margaret. She got married to a fellow by the last name of Larkin, who was a lawyer, and they kind of took control of the family estate and things of that nature. And Pat, being about 18 years old, he just decided he was going to leave, and he jumped on a horse and headed west. And he was going to be a farmer. He tried that for a couple of years near Grapevine, Texas, just southeast of Dallas, and tried his hand at farming, but was not successful at doing that. He moved on a little bit further west and um, got into buffalo hunting, and that was a big time profession, being a buffalo hunter back in those days. And there are pictures of him standing in front of or cowboys back then standing in front of just huge piles of buffalo skin. It was a very profitable business. They would sell the meat to the military who was out there working to help establish territories. This was after the American-Spanish War in the 1840s. and so they were, this was still the Wild West, and still very much a, an unorganized, kind of a everyone for themselves type of territory. And but buffalo hunting was it until literally they run out of buffalo, and that's it's disappointing to hear that, but that's how they made a living, was to do that. And Pat Garrett was involved in that, until there was no more. He also had a run in with, it was a time where you had to very much look after yourself, defend yourself, and Pat Garrett was caught in a dispute with a man, and he ended up shooting and killing a man, as a young fella himself. But it was in self defense, and that was proven out, and he was freed on that. So after the buffalo, the great cattle baron, John Simpson Chisholm, had a huge cattle ranch, and he had over 100,000 head of cattle, and he would move cattle from Texas up through New Mexico and then to Kansas. And Pat Garrett got hired on as a cowboy for that, and so between, at an early age, he became very proficient in Louisiana with a rifle, and hunting and shooting, and he was very accurate. Made him really good with buffalo hunting, obviously, and same with the cowboy, working with John Chisholm, because back then they also had, not only just the people who were out there who were indigenous people. You had the Mescalero Apaches, who were close by, and so once again it was a lot of self defense, and you were on your own. But he got on with John Chisholm, and John got to where he was very confident with Pat, and Pat was known as very dependable, very very much of a he had a lot of management type qualities about him, and he was very determined, and so that perseverance carried him on for the rest of his life. So at the same time, New Mexico had fallen into, from a political standpoint, had been controlled by what was known as the Santa Fe Ring, and these were men that controlled a lot of New Mexico, and it was all for their own selfish gain. And they had political connections back to the capital, the territorial capital, and depending on who the territorial governor was at the time, they could be in cahoots with the Santa Fe Ring, which was all politically and all corrupt and all biased to one side. They would buy off the local lawmen, and basically control the any type of business that was going on in the state, and particularly in the center part of the state, where the town of Lincoln was from, which is what Pat Garrett was associated with, because that was the county seat. And back then, Lincoln County was one third the size of the state. It was a huge county, and so in 1878, now Pat by that time would have been, in his late 20s. Um, it was time they were trying to bring some sort of law and order to the state of New Mexico. And Pat lived in Lincoln at that time, and just outside of Lincoln, and at Eagle Pass is the name of that place. And you can see there's all kinds of markers out in New Mexico to see that. But he had a ranch out there, and and they had a change in the territorial government. The one previous to Lew Wallace, which is the one connected to Pat Garrett, was very corrupt, and they ended up the president. Those are presidential appointments, and they ended up removing. His name was Axtell, and they ended up removing him and they brought in this Lew Wallace. Now, Lew Wallace, to some of you, may be a familiar name because while he was out there as territorial governor at this period of time, which was just for a couple of years, he wrote the novel Ben-Hur, and so that's kind of a side note, and kind of gives you an idea of how intertwined a lot of history is uh, out there. I mean, with different things than just there's just not a whole lot of people, not a whole lot of population back then. But Lew Wallace was looking for a man who had the courage, who had the determination, who had the guts to really bring law and order to New Mexico, because until they got that, they were not going to become a state. And Lew Wallace knew that. He knew that from the president of the United States at the time, and so he asked John Chisholm. John Chisholm knew everybody and very influential in New Mexico. And also, John Chisholm was against the Santa Fe ring, so they knew they had to take that head on, and they needed a very strong person to do that. And Lew Wallace asked John Chisholm, "Do you know anyone who could fill this role? Because we've got to get a handle on this and get and establish law and order in this state." And he said, "Yeah, I know a man. His name is Pat Garrett." And so there was an election held, and Pat Garrett was elected sheriff in 1880. So he walks into a situation where, uh, again, the Santa Fe ring had been going on uh, for a long time, and they were starting to get people to come in that were competition. And the most famous at that time was an Englishman by the name of John Tunstall. And John Tunstall was a gentleman of a fella, but he was a good businessman. And he didn't mind the competition, didn't mind the confrontations that he was going to run into. And so that really started the friction. Now, at the same time and separately, you had this young fella by the name of Billy the Kid, who he was born in New York City. He came across with his mother and little brother, and they settled in Silver City, New Mexico. And his mother had tuberculosis, and that was a bad disease back in the 1800s, and 1 in 7 people had tuberculosis back then. And they thought coming out west to where you had the arid atmosphere to breathe would help that, which was not right, not true. And she ended up passing away and leaving Billy. Billy was at the time 17, 18 years of age, and really had, his little brother went a separate way. He had no father. And so Billy had gotten into some trouble in Silver City where he was in a card game, and of course, just being an older teenager, a little bit full of himself, he got into it with an older gentleman, a bigger guy, and they got into a fist fight over a dispute about a card game, and that carried out into the streets. And the older gentleman, bigger guy, was on top of Billy. Billy pulled his gun, the gentleman's gun, out and shot the man and killed him. And Billy automatically was labeled, a killer at that young age. And so Billy had to go on the run, and he ends up coming back east to the Lincoln County area, and Fort Sumter, which was northeast of Lincoln and Lincoln County. So when Pat was elected, Billy was already a menace. He was a young kid, full of himself. Um, you know, thought he very confident with a gun, very good with a gun, but still a kid doing reckless things, and was was uh, again very much of a what was perceived to be a menace and contrary to the establishment of rule and law in the territory. And Billy, uh, in 1778, um, John Tunstall, who I mentioned earlier, who had come in, who was also adversaries with the Santa Fe Ring, he took Billy under his wing, and Billy really loved him for it, respected him for it. They had a very close relationship, and it was thought that at the time that John Tunstall was going to be able to turn Billy around and make a good man out of him. And Billy was really willing to work. He was willing to do whatever Mr. Tunstall wanted done. But the trouble with the Santa Fe Ring and the local sheriffs there in Lincoln County, who were bought off by him, they didn't like John Tunstall, and one day they shot and killed John. And Billy was off hiding off in a distance. John Tunstall had asked him to go off a little ways, that he would handle this confrontation one on one, but John Tunstall didn't even carry a gun, and they shot him. These guys with the Santa Fe Ring and the regulators, they just shot him and killed him, and that just absolutely infuriated Billy. Divorce. And yeah, and so not only did they shoot John Tunstall, but they also killed his horse too, as as spite, to John, just to let everybody know who's controlling things around there, and it wasn't going to be him either. And you'll see in some movies there was also a lawyer by the name of Alex McSween, and they ended up killing him as well. This group, but part of that was Billy, is now he's going to get revenge, and he's going to kill everybody that was associated with killing, his mentor and his father figure, John Tunstall. And with that, he became even more reckless about whatever needed to be done to deal with that, and that could include stealing cattle if they needed to eat, or taking a horse if they wanted it. And he had a group of kind of desperados that fell in with him too. And the best depiction I've ever seen of that is, if you get a chance, you watch the movie Young Guns, especially the first one. It does a fairly good job at depicting the that situation, both Young Guns 1 and 2. But Billy, uh, it got to be more of a confrontational issue. And so him and his group, they came into town. They were going to deal. The sheriff had been bought off. They were going to come in and deal with and do away with the sheriff. And so they come into town, and it's Sheriff Brady, and his deputy, and they're behind a corral fence, Billy and his group, and they open fire on the sheriff and his deputy in the street of Lincoln, and they kill him. And now all of a sudden, Billy now has shot a sheriff, and that's really crossing the line there. And so there was a warrant put out for his arrest, and at that time, Pat Garrett was sheriff-elect, but him and his deputies, they tracked down Billy and his men at a place called Stinking Springs, New Mexico, and in that, Pat Garrett's strategy was, the men were holed up in a cabin. They had a fire going, but they didn't. They were very limited on food, and they brought their horses into. It was the winter was so bad that they brought their horses into the cabin to keep them warm, and and just to show you Pat Garrett's perseverance, it didn't matter. He would ride in the snow in the worst of conditions, day and night, to get his man. I mean, he just had that kind of determination and perseverance, and so came to Stinking Springs, and came up on them, had them trapped in the house, Pat Garrett decided he's just going to wait him out, and he did, and Pat had told him, "Hey, you guys come out, your hands up, and I'll arrest you, and you'll get a trial." And he was again trying to establish law and order, um, and but he had an arrest warrant, so that situation was interesting in that one of Billy's friends, a guy by the name of Charlie Baudry, was in there, and he came out with his hands up, but he pulled a gun as soon as he hit the door, and Pat or one of his men shot him and killed him, and then Billy, so they pulled him back in and into the cabin, and then Billy had one of the horses go out. Well, Pat Garrett shot and killed the horse in the doorway, and so now they're really trapped. They cannot get out at all. And eventually, they're hungry. Pat has waited them out, and he ends up arresting them. And they take Billy down to a southern town just south of Las Cruces, a little town called Mesilla, and that's where they have the trial for Billy the Kid. And uh, in today's world, the best evidence, they didn't have any actual evidence. And back then you had to have actual evidence, but at best they had circumstantial evidence on Billy. And he's out of everybody in this what they called the Lincoln County Wars, which was started with Billy shooting John Tunstall and starting this feud between these two groups. That was called the Lincoln County Wars, and that lasted from 1878 until 1880. But they arrested Billy. Pat took him down to that was at that time that was where the courthouse was down in Mesilla, and they had a trial, and they found Billy guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to hang. And so they brought him back up to Lincoln and had him in a jail there, and he was to be hung. And this would have been in early 1881, in April, I believe, of 1881. And while Billy was there, Pat still had other business to tend to. He also was a tax collector for the county and had other parts of the county to look after. And he was gone. He left two deputies, a deputy by the name of Bell, who was kind of a mild mannered fella, and then a guy that was somewhat of a bully, guy by the name of Bob Olinger. And they were there to guard Billy. And Billy was, this was upstairs in the courthouse. If you were to go to Lincoln today, that courthouse is preserved just exactly as it was back then. It's a nice tour that they do there. The Historical Society out there is outstanding with that, and they've done a good job with that. So if you're ever out that way and you get a chance to stop through Lincoln, it's worth the visit for that. So Pat's gone. The deputies are there. Olinger goes across the street to get to get dinner. Billy's upstairs with his Bell, deputy sheriff, and Billy's got to go to the bathroom, and all they've got is the outhouse that's out back. And Billy goes out there, and Bell is he's a very likable individual. But on the way back, as they're going up the stairs, Billy takes Bell's gun from him, a handgun, 6-shooter, and he shoots and kills Bell, and then goes upstairs and grabs a shotgun that Olinger had, and it was full of dimes. The barrels were. And Olinger was across the street. As soon as he heard the gunshot where Billy had shot Bell, he didn't know it, but he knew there was a problem. He comes running out of the saloon. Billy breaks out the window to the sheriff's office and says hello to Bob. And Bob stops in the middle of the street, and Billy shoots him with both barrels of that shotgun full of dimes, and kills him dead right there in the middle of the street. And then comes down And now people are really afraid of Billy the Kid because he's a cold-blooded murderer. I mean, and now he's killed two more lawmen, and he takes off. Billy takes off. So Pat comes back into town. He hears about it. Lew Wallace, who now is territorial governor, there had been a discussion between Billy the Kid and Lew Wallace about Billy turning state's evidence against the Santa Fe ring. And if Billy kept his nose clean, then he would Lew Wallace would give him a pardon. And there's always been controversy about that. But what people don't, what they conveniently forget is that Billy's end of the bargain was you wouldn't get any more trouble. And here Billy is, he shot and killed two of Pat Garrett's deputies. So Billy takes off. Pat Garrett, there's an arrest warrant now for Billy the Kid, dead or alive, which a lot of people are like, oh, you could have arrested him. Well, no, now it's serious. He was already going to hang for murdering Sheriff Brady and his deputy. Now he's murdered two of Pat's deputies. So now we're gonna get him. So a lot of people thought that Billy would head to Mexico because he was very, very much liked by the Hispanic people of that day and time. And Pat said, no, I don't think he's going to go down there. I think he's going to go to up to Fort Sumner, which was a pretty good ride uh, for uh, for Pat and his deputies. Um, and and Pat and Billy were somewhat acquaintances. I mean, Billy, obviously, Pat was familiar with Lincoln, the town of Lincoln. So was Billy. So they would obviously pass each other and knew each other. So it wasn't like they were strangers to each other or fugitives in that respect. I mean, Pat knew him, and obviously Billy knew Pat, and so, so off Pat went. He went to Fort Sumner. Sure enough, Billy had gone up there, and at that time, Fort Sumner was originally a fort of 40 acres of of to hold Indians who were brought on reservations, and there was a military outpost there, and that's how it got its name, Fort Sumner. But by this time, by the 1880s, that had been abandoned, and a very prominent Hispanic fellow by the name of Pete Maxwell had owned this property, and he was there, and it was like a fort. It was a kind of a compound style of situation, and so Billy felt very comfortable, very protected there with the Hispanics and with Pete Maxwell, and in fact, he had a girlfriend named Polita Maxwell, who was Pete's daughter, and so Billy was holed up there, and so one night after Pat and his deputies, he had two deputies, a guy by the name of Poe, and another deputy by that time who came to help. They came to search out Billy and to bring him to justice. And so in that, it was the dead of the night. This would have been July 14th, 1881, and Billy uh, had was hungry and had gone to where they kept the meat at, but he saw these two deputies. He didn't recognize them. He couldn't see them because it was dark, but he was curious about what was going on, that it was unusual. And so Pete Maxwell's bedroom was upstairs in one of the old barracks that they had there. And Pat Garrett had gone up there because he knew Pete Maxwell as well and wanted to know from Pete in a very low voice, where is Billy? or is Billy here first? And yeah, Billy's around, and so Pat, is trying to get information for that, and so while he's up there and it's dark, um, Billy comes up to ask Pete what's going on, and he can hear talking going on, and he says in Spanish, "Who is it? Who is it?" He asked twice. Well, Pat instantly recognized his voice, and Pat shot him. First shot him twice. First bullet hit him in the heart, killed him instantly, and as he was falling, Pat fired again, and it went over his shoulder and into the wall. So there's always a dispute as to, was it a fair fight? Was it, did Pat shoot him in the back, or was it real? Did Pat really kill him? Um, I met the great granddaughter of at that time, after any killing, they always had a coroner's inquest. In other words, they would have a jury of men come together and discuss whether or not this was a legal killing, or this was murder, or it was self-defense. They would always decide. And I got the chance to meet the great great granddaughter of the foreman of that jury, and she was able to verify to me that yeah, indeed they were able to identify the body and to confirm what had happened as being the truth. And so Pat Garrett did indeed kill Billy the Kid, and so that kind of ended that terror of time. Lou Wallace, he was in those assignments. Those appointments were for 2 year stints, and then Lou Wallace was off and back east. He was from Crawfordsville, Indiana, which is another great place if you're ever up that way and you get a chance to stop by the Lou Wallace. They called it a museum, but it was actually his library and study. Very, very, very fascinating um, place to visit as well too. And it's a registered state registered park, but it's got great history in it. And just a snippet of that was with more. You'll see more about Ben Hur there than you will about Pat Garrett, but it was very, very. It's a very great place to visit. So so afterwards, with that, Pat, what a lot of people don't understand or don't even know about Pat was he had 8 children, and as I said, I came from number 7. Pat would name his children after close friends of his. So he had 4 sons and 4 daughters. His first one was Adelaide, who was actually named after his first girlfriend that Pat had back in Grapevine, Texas. And her name was Ida. She was born in early 1881, and She died at age 15 from tonsillitis, which was sad. And then in 1864, or I'm sorry, 1884, they had a second daughter, and her name was Elizabeth. And Elizabeth had a special life all to her own, and she was blinded early at birth. They put drops in the baby's eyes, and it blinded her. And so Pat and his wife Apollinaria, who was full-blooded Mexican, Hispanic. They had this daughter who was blind, and then not long after that, they had a son, and his name was John Poe, and they called him Poe. And Poe is important because that was Pat Garrett's deputy, and they were very close. And Poe was from Kentucky, actually from Mayfield, Kentucky. And Poe had come out there, and he had gotten in with Pat Garrett, and again, he had his own amazing life after all of this as well too, down in Roswell. And there's a really good book called Buckboard Days that his wife, Poe's wife, had written about kind of Poe's side of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid and their life in Roswell. And you can go down to Roswell and see a lot of Poe, and there's still a lot down there about him with that. But Pat's second daughter, Elizabeth, Pat was determined to make her life as normal as could be for a blind child. And he really was devoted to his daughter. And he was only sheriff for a couple of years at that time. And also a U.S. Marshal because Fort Sumner was in a different county. And in order to deal with Billy the Kid, he had to be also be a U.S. Marshal as well as a sheriff. But those days were over, and he was back to being a family man, and um, he he had to figure out how to get her educated, and she's blind, and so Pat had figured out to send her to the School of the Deaf and Blind in Austin, Texas. Now, Austin, Texas, as you well know, from El Paso or from down around where Pat was from, it's on the other side of the state, and the only way that you could really get there was by train. So Pat Garrett went down to the train station with Elizabeth when it was time for her to start elementary school, and he took her the first time to down there to that school in Austin, Texas. And he told her, he said, "This will be the only time, sweetie, that I will ride the train with you from now on out. You get on the train, and when you come home and you get to El Paso, I will be there to pick you up." Which Pat was always there. A very, very good father, a very caring father. Um, as Elizabeth grew older, and as she was completing elementary school, a note was sent home, and they said, um, "Elizabeth has done very well in school, but you need to know that your daughter is a musical prodigy in soprano voice and in piano." And this was like stunning to the family. But Elizabeth was very much an accomplished uh, songwriter, singer. She had her own amazing life, and you can go online today, and the New Mexico state song was composed, written by Elizabeth Garrett. And she composed that and sang that in front of the New Mexico state legislature when she was in her early 20s. And they adopted that as their state song. And it is still today. So she had a great career she toured the country. She was called the Songbird of the Southwest, and she performed. She'd go to Chicago. She went to New York. She actually met Helen Keller in New York, and her and Helen worked with helping to establish the Red Cross in New York City to help soldiers who were coming back from war. This was during World War I now, to help them and care for them. And of course, Helen Keller, she was blind as well and deaf as well. Um, and they became very, very good friends. And Helen wrote about Elizabeth. Helen Keller had several biographies, and one of them is called Midstream. And this is about halfway through her life. And in her book, she talks about her very, very good friend, Elizabeth Garrett. And Elizabeth was able to talk her and the musician John Sousa, who was so popular back in that day and time, back in the early 1900s, talked them into coming out and helping raise money to build a school for the deaf and blind in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And that school is still there today. And there's buildings named after Elizabeth with that. And she was very independent. Obviously, she had no problems traveling on trains and singing at state fairs or world fairs and those whatever venues were like that. She was just a very, very amazing individual, and all that's only because Pat made the diligent effort, year in, year out, to make sure that Elizabeth had as normal a life as possible for that. And Elizabeth If you go to Las Cruces, that's where the Garrett burial plot is. And in there, you'll find seven of the children, including my grandfather and my mother, there, along with Pat Garrett and his wife Apollinaria, and the other seven siblings. But Elizabeth is she had moved away and had established her life in Roswell, New Mexico, and you can go out to the cemetery there and find her stone there. But she lived her life, a full life there, and uh, just just a remarkable individual, and that. So as time goes on, again, there are other children that are born, and when my you can read it. Guy by the name of C.L. Senichin, great historian. The very first book I'd read about anything about Pat Garrett was by a lady by the name of Ruth Hall, and it was actually about Elizabeth. But in there, I read they mentioned my grandfather by name, as the next baby that had come along, and so with that, the Garretts had their family, and was raising their family primarily in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and then Pat moved down to Uvalde, Texas, and so if you happen to be passing through there, you'll see a marker about him being there. And one of the interesting things there is one of Billy the Kid's uh, outlaw friends, a guy by the name of Billy Wilson. He had moved down there, and sometimes you'll hear about Billy Wilson indirectly. The gun that Pat Garrett actually used to shoot Billy the Kid was Billy Wilson's six shooter. And a couple of years ago, that gun sold for $6 million to someone in England, which is just, I wish I had that gun, but it had gotten out of the family with that. But Billy Wilson was actually down in Uvalde, and Pat Garrett ran into him. And there was an arrest warrant for Billy Wilson as well, too. But this is years after. And Pat Garrett recognizes him, and Billy Wilson knew Pat Garrett. And finally, they came face to face, and Billy said, Pat was like, hey, how you doing? Looks like you straightened out your life, and they talked a little bit, and he wanted to be friends with Billy. Pat did, and Billy said, or yeah, Billy Wilson said, well, but there's still an arrest warrant out on that, and Pat Garrett got involved directly with President Grover Cleveland at the time to get Billy Wilson a full pardon for that. So he was free and clear of that. And so Pat stayed down there. Again, the family's growing. So then, kind of later in at time, and we're getting towards the turn of the century. Um, there is a very respected fellow by name of Colonel Albert Fountain, and he's from down in Mesilla. He was a colonel in the Confederate Army. He had settled in down in Mesilla, very prominent individual, very respected individual in that part of the country. But he too got into a confrontation with still what existed was the Santa Fe Ring. And with that, Colonel Fountain had lots of courage, and he was going to go up to, again, this would have been up in Santa Fe now, where the Santa Fe Ring was at. And Albert Fountain goes up there to take issue with problems that they were having with that, and he was going to represent the people of South New Mexico. And while he was up there, they threatened him, and his wife, Albert Colonel Fountain's wife, had sent their little boy Henry with Fountain. And this was during the winter. And back then, you did not shoot somebody if they had a child with them, let alone shoot a child. And so the mother thought that Albert would be safe with with little Henry going with them. And so on the way, and so they go up there. Albert is threatened with his life while he's there, and said, "If you follow through with with this issue, you're gonna be killed." And Albert, for himself, that didn't bother him. And with little Henry there, he thought there'll be no problem. Well, they they were on their way back home. They had just crossed into the White Sands, and we're coming up the hill. There's beautiful mountains there called Oregon Mountains, beautiful mountains. And they were just coming up on that pass, and they were ambushed, and both of them, both Albert and the little boy, was shot and killed. And an unbelievable event, very shocking to the people of Las Cruces. And all they could find was they saw some carriage tracks going off into the sand. They found some pools of blood, but there was no evidence, no eyewitnesses to the murders. Of course, back then they didn't have the ability to test DNA or anything like that. Um, and um, and so they have this this case that needs to be resolved. They get a hold of Pat Garrett and they bring him up out of Uvalde and bring him back to Las Cruces and make him sheriff to track down the murderers of Albert Fountain. And so Pat spent several years tracking these men down, which he did, and brought them to trial. They had a change of venue because everyone around Las Cruces knew these men and obviously knew Pat Garrett, and they had a change of venue. But again, they had no actual hard evidence. All they had was circumstantial evidence, which in today's court, a lot of trials go to court. If you had hard evidence, it's open and shut case. But back then, you had to have it to prove somebody to be guilty. Otherwise, it's just their word against your word, basically, no matter what the circumstantial evidence was. And today, the only trials you really see go to court are the ones where there's just circumstantial evidence. There may be a procedural type of trial, but the real ones are the ones where somebody's going to have to make a decision as to whether or not this is what's happened. But back then, they were acquitted off of it, which was very sad, very disappointing to Pat, because he knew they did it. And you can read history books on, he actually had tracked them down and arrested them. And they knew they were in trouble. They knew they'd been caught, but in a court, and again, ironically, another fellow from Kentucky, from Frankfort, Kentucky, a guy by the name of Albert Fall. He was a lawyer out there and Albert was slick. He would play both sides depending on where his advantage was. But he had moved out there from Kentucky, and in this particular case, he was the lawyer uh, for these guys that Pat had arrested, and Albert uh, Fall had got them off and got them acquitted for that. His name comes up later in Pat Garrett's life as a proponent of Pat Garrett, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. But so now we're into this time. Pat's very disappointed, but he's made a name for himself. I mean, and at the same time, you have Theodore Roosevelt elected president now. So Pat Garrett has known Grover Cleveland. He had met William McKinley, and now he knows uh, President Roosevelt. And Roosevelt is really big on anybody who is somebody out west, particularly lawmen. And he really took a liking to Pat Garrett. And Pat, there you can find this online, but there's a number of letters that were written on White House stationery from Pat back to his wife, Apollinaria, just checking on her with that. And I think he visited the White House maybe 4 times. And then, but Roosevelt appointed him as customs collector, which was again, it was a presidential appointment, but it was in El Paso, Texas. And of course, Pat was from Las Cruces, New Mexico. So there was a big division over Pat being from New Mexico, but yet he's in Texas being the customs collector. And again, Pat Garrett is by the book type of guy. And he knew that there was a lot of corruption. Imagine this, a lot of corruption back then of people not paying their proper amount of taxes, and they were coming over the border with goods, whether it be animals or whether it be blankets or whatever. And Pat was all about what's the law say, and we're going to go by the law. And so Pat held that job for a couple of years. And my grandfather was born when Pat Garrett was customs collector. So my grandfather was actually born in El Paso, Texas, for that. And again, just to show you how devoted he was to his friends, my grandfather, his name is Oscar Loman Garrett. And Oscar Loman was a businessman. He had a brother named Martin Loman. They were successful businessmen in Las Cruces. Oscar was very good friends with my grandfather, my great grandfather, and he had a little girl, and she had a dress on, and she was playing with matches, and her dress caught fire and burned her up and killed her. She was just 5 years old, and not long after that happened, my grandfather was born, and Pat named him after Oscar Loman, as a recognition of Oscar and for his daughter. So that's how my grandfather, which is kind of an unusual name, but that's how he got his name. So Pat Garrett was tax collector. He was also good friends with a fellow by the name of Tom Powers, and Tom Powers ran a saloon and up in there in El Paso, and they were good friends. Pat was not a perfect person. He was one for being he was into he didn't mind having a drink, and certainly loved to gamble. He loved to play cards. He loved to race horses. One of the people that he met when he was down in Uvalde was a guy by the name of James Garner. Now, again, most people wouldn't know his name, but he was vice president to President Roosevelt in one of his terms. But at the time, he was just another guy. They were racing horses and that kind of thing. So Pat wasn't a perfect individual by no stretch of the imagination. But if he was your friend, he was always your friend, no matter what. And so he was friends with his Tom Powers. And so Pat Garrett got invited to a reunion of Theodore Roosevelt with the Rough Riders that he was with, and invited to San Antonio for a reunion. And Tom Powers desperately wanted to go, and Pat Garrett didn't really have an invitation for Tom, and Tom was known as someone who owned a saloon and was a gambler, and Roosevelt was very, very much against that kind of thing and didn't want any publicity with that at all. But they go to the reunion. Pat takes Tom with him and tells him, "Hey, you need to really keep a low profile," which Tom did. Um, but there ends up, and you can find this online too, there's a photograph of Pat Garrett with Theodore Roosevelt at the dinner, and also one of them standing. And in this picture is Tom Powers. And one of Roosevelt's aides recognizes Tom Powers and tells President Roosevelt. And so Roosevelt felt that, you know, Pat had used his invitation that Pat knew that Roosevelt wouldn't approve of, and sure enough, that comes back to hurt him when it's time for reappointment to being a custom collector. So that was the end of that, and so now we're in the early 1900s, and Pat has decided that he's going to, my grandfather is born in 1903, and then he has a brother that is born, his youngest brother, the eighth child. His name is Jarvis, which comes from the Garrett side, Jarvis Powers Garrett. So again, names him after his good friend Tom Powers, even though even though Tom had got him into a little bit of trouble with Roosevelt, and and by that time they'd moved back to Las Cruces for that. Pat buys a farm back at the Oregon Mountain Pass. It's called St. Augustine. Again, it's on an improved highway. They've got a marker there for that, but he had a ranch there, and it was probably about 7 or 8 miles outside of Las Cruces. And so Pat lived out there to raise his family. He had these boys at home. He had a daughter Pauline. There was the first four kids, and then there were the second four. There was a little bit of time in between that. And Pauline was part of that second four, and um, they had another daughter um, who who was after Elizabeth, and I've got a really nice picture of them, those two, and when they were kids, and they were dressed up and all, but and she died of pneumonia when she was only 21, and she had 3 kids or 2 kids. No, she had 3 kids. She had 2 boys and a girl, and at that time, Pauline was engaged to be married. She broke off her engagement so she could take those kids in and raise them herself for that. And it was just again another example of the Garretts and their need to take care of their family and do whatever it took to look after their family. So Pat is, and the reason I mentioned Pauline is that um, in 1908, and this was on leap year day, so February 29th. Pat and a friend of his are going to go to Las Cruces to settle an issue. Pat had leased part of his ranch to a fellow by the name of Braswell. His last name was Braswell, and Pat was under the agreement was for him to let lease the land for cattle, and Braswell had brought goats. And if you know anything about goats, they will eat everything to the nubbins,
And pull the roots up.
and oh yeah, and Pat was just furious over this and determined to get this straightened out. So that morning, um, Pat was going to go to and did was going to go to Las Cruces by buggy, and they cross really an open desert between Oregon, little small town of Oregon, and Las Cruces. And my grandfather, who at the time was 3, or no, I'm sorry, he was 4. Yeah, he was 4. Um, he was supposed to go with him that morning, but the previous day, Oscar, being the little rascal that he was, his mother had just got through scrubbing the wood floors of their house with water and lye soap. And Oscar had come around the corner running, probably him and his little brother Jarvis. And um, Oscar slipped and fell and slid into that bucket of lye soap, knocked it over, and burned his legs. And so that next morning, he had bandages on his legs, and his dad said he couldn't go with him. And that really, they left Oscar at home crying because he really wanted to go with his dad to Las Cruces. And it was a little bit of a chilly morning, so Pat sets out for Las Cruces, and he had left. He didn't have a coat, and Apollinaria, his wife, said, "Hey, Pauline, jump on a horse and take this coat to your dad." And she did. She took the coat to his dad, and he was appreciative of that and said to her, "Look, I'll bring you back a little pretty um, from town when I come back." And so Pauline was the last one to see Pat alive, because shortly after that, this Brazel came up on horseback, and they got into an argument. Him and Pat did, over these goats, and and Pat told him, said, "Look, I'm going to get you off this property, off my property, one way or the other." And that's a threat. And back then, you could kill somebody in self-defense if somebody threatened you, which today you wouldn't be able to do that, but unless you were going to get physically harmed. But Brazel was on horseback. They were in a buggy. Him and his buddy was in a buggy, and Brazel ends up shooting Pat Garrett in the back of the head and kills him. And this is out in the middle of this desert area. There's a marker out there. You would unless you knew people who knew where that marker was at, you couldn't find it. But it is a nice marker. I've been out there several times. With that, in fact, I helped fund a bigger establishment of that marker, and been able to go out there, take my grandson out there, and show him, and we got pictures and all that. But so he was killed. Brazel goes into town and says, "Hey, look, I shot him, but he threatened me, and I shot and killed him." Well, again, this he goes to trial, and he's found innocent because Brazel made the case that even though I admit to shooting him, it was in self-defense. So, there's some stories that maybe, you know, some, uh, some fast gun shot Pat Garrett and all that. But, when you really look at the circumstances and out in the middle of nowhere, and Brazel admitting to it right away, Brazel did it. And so that ended Pat Garrett's life. So he was 58 when he was assassinated, but yet lived a super full life, and very much family focused. All his letters, he asked about how the kids were doing. Apollinaria never learned English. Afterwards, she moved into town, into Las Cruces, sold the ranch. They didn't get very much money for it. They were in debt. He didn't have very much money when he was shot. But their little house that she lives in, there's a famous photo of her holding the gun that killed Billy the Kid, and that went all the way. Tom Power's family felt like they owned it because Pat had allowed Tom to put that gun, that pistol, up in his saloon. And there got to be a dispute between the families that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1936, the Supreme Court ruled that gun belonged to the Garretts. And so Apollinaria, there's a picture of her.
And someone made this painting for you.
Yeah, so this is a watercolor of Apollinaria. It was done by one of the friends of Pat Garrett. There's a group of people out there that they've spent most of their lives with, carrying on his history and his legacy for that, which I'm so grateful for. But she painted this watercolor, which she gave to me. She presented it to me. Very, very special to me for that. And
She was very proud to have that gun back too. You can tell.
She was very proud about it. And what you don't see in the picture is the lawyers came down from Washington to give her the gun, and to give her the paperwork that it legally belonged to her. And it stayed in the family for many years. And like I said at the onset, that again, that was Billy Wilson's gun, that Pat used, and now it's in England, and the last price on it was $6 million. The other thing I wish I had access to was after Billy, or after Pat shot and killed Billy the Kid, Lew Wallace had a solid gold badge made, for Pat Garrett and had inscribed it on the back. And it's wonderful. I mean, there's only one badge like that. But last I heard, it had been sold at an auction for $250,000. So those things went pretty quick. I wish.
Museum.
No, it's in a private collection, just as a gun is for that. So it's so anyway, there's a lot with that. One of the things that I wanted to do, I was a lot of people that have family that are famous, and I went through a little bit of this where I'm recognized, I'm given, I'm presented gifts, but the Friends of Pat Garrett, who still that group still exists today, they had spent most of their lives dedicated to the preservation of Pat Garrett, which I'm so thankful for. And so back in 2021, I commissioned a sculptor out of Salt Lake City, Utah, to make a statue. And he's about 16, 17 inches tall of Pat Garrett. And this picture is on this book that current historian that can tell you everything and anything about Pat Garrett. His name's Dave Thomas, and very, very good guy. But two others, Carla Steen and Sally, they had found a tintype of this picture of Pat Garrett when he was a young man, and this is their picture. They used it for this book. On the back of the book, you can see a picture of Apollinaria holding the gun for that. But Dave Thomas does an excellent job with the chronology of that. And then before Dave Thomas, everybody stood on the shoulders of Leon Metz. And if you know anything about Western law or just Western life, Leon Metz is the guy. So this book is the first book that I bought years and years and years ago. And I bought it actually in Missouri underneath the arch. There was a bookstore down there, and it just so happened to have a book of my great grandfather, and I just bought it. I wasn't sure exactly what I was buying, but I bought it, and it turns out Leon Metz is, and he'll tell you his biography of Pat Garrett is pretty accurate as well too. But I had a statue made. I wanted to thank them on behalf of the Garretts. I wanted to thank people that had spent a lot of their lives with learning and finding out the truth and understanding not just Pat Garrett, but also Billy the Kid too, because there's always two sides to the story, right? So I wanted to recognize them and in a special way and in a unique way, and one that would mean something different to each one of them because they each brought a different perspective of Pat Garrett. And so it just couldn't be like a certificate but it had to be something that was unique, something that you just you wouldn't find in a store, like some crystal, vase or something like that. I wanted something that was very unique, but when they looked at it, they could look at it through their perspective. And each one of them has a different perspective and brought different things about Pat Garrett and their understanding. And so I was able to come up with this statute. It was again made from a company. It's made out of marble, and on the back of it, just so that people wouldn't forget, it's kind of hard to see, but on the back, Pat rarely signed his full name on anything, um, uh, but on an arrest warrant for a horse thief, just 2 weeks after the killing of Billy the Kid, he signed an arrest warrant with his full name. And so we were able to take that signature. I don't know if you can see that on there or not.
It's really neat. It says Pat Garrett, Sheriff.
Pat F. Garrett, Sheriff. And it's in his, it's a similarity to his signature. And so they know that and they have that. And they were very, very taken aback and thankful for that. But that was appropriate recognition for people that I admire so much for someone for, I mean, for people to spend your life, with your relative, preserving that. And I told them when I made the presentation, and it was at the end of a festival that we were having, there was probably a couple hundred people there. And I told them, I said one of the high qualities of Pat Garrett was that he was always true to his friends. And
In this day, that is a very admirable
yeah,
attribute to have.
long life
It is
friends,
being appreciated.
long life friends, and they are the friends of Pat Garrett. And I said, and Pat would really, he would be thrilled that they were his friends, like they are still to this day. And so they have this now. Each of them have a statute, and we were able to recognize that publicly, which I wanted to do, as well, and thank them on behalf of the Garrett family. So
I thank you so very much, John. I have to say, I said, Scott, so I want to talk about John in a second, but Scott, if you want to know the true story of Pat Garrett, this is it. This is a walking, talking history of Pat Garrett from his great grandson, who still cares very much for the man he was, the legacy that he left. And the legacy is of a family man. But everything he did with vigor, he did with passion, and he did with intelligence and honesty.
he was going to go by the law, and
Exactly.
and he was known for his courage, but he was going to establish law. And his daughter said that, that Elizabeth, that, his contribution, to New Mexico, the state, was by his gun, bringing law and order, and hers contribution was through her voice and her singing. So Pat had that reputation back then and he was, again, he had his faults, and you can read about them, but we all do, right? And so, but to have a friend, a good friend, and Kelly's one of those, and she's got friends, lifelong friends, and I'm sure many of y'all do too. There's nothing, the Bible tells us about, someone, Jesus talks about the importance of friendships, and that a man, who would lay down his life for a friend is very, very special. And Pat Garrett was like that very much.
Yes. And true to his family.
Yeah.
My husband has always said too, I can feel the anger he had for the guy who tricked him, saying, I'm going to put cattle on your land, and he put goats. Goats will absolutely take. My husband's always said a farmer has to be a grass farmer first. Before you can be a cattle farmer, you have to be a grass farmer. And that's what he was. And Scott, you and your love of your family and the nurturing you and Jackie have done with your family. And I just have to bring this up. He has an incredible son who is a preacher at Columbia Christian Church, which is down the road from me in Columbia, Kentucky. And he's even an author. This is something I would love to be able to do. And I think everyone, after hearing this, seeing this, Scott, you need to write a book. You need to write a book, man, because don't research Pat Garrett by and especially some of the recent stuff that's being put out. I think it's inflammatory, and I think it's drawing conclusions from, I don't know what, I think to get likes or hits or whatever you get. You are the real deal. Yeah. This is the Pat Garrett story. This is how it happened. And John, his son is an incredible author. And I have to tell you, John's daughter, Jordan Davis, you can get her book on Amazon too. She is a middle schooler and she has 2 books out now. But I think this is a really good book that she wrote with a friend. So I tell you, the legacy just keeps going.
So I've got
Be very proud, Scott.
Yeah. We Jack and I are very proud of our kids, and so John writes a Christian book, and and boy, if you get a chance, it's an easy read, but I think every human ought to read this book. It's that good, and yeah, he's my son, but it's a really good
Very
book.
well written.
And then he's got a daughter who writes about murder, so 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 I'm like, okay, we got you know we got a dad who's a Christian writer, and then we got a daughter who writes about murder. So
She's just very well founded. She has a strong foundation.
oh
So
yeah,
just going out there and experimenting
yeah,
with different styles of writing, and
that's right.
I just love it. But Scott, I can't thank you
Oh,
enough.
yeah,
You and Jackie welcomed me in your home, but
yeah.
I have wanted to do this interview forever. And they will be coming close to where I live in a few days. And we're going to do a follow up interview on this exact topic because I'm sure there's things you thought of that you didn't bring up in
Yeah.
the interview.
Yeah, there's
So
so
we're
much.
going to do a second. You could do a part 2, part 3, but I want to thank you.
Yeah,
And thank you for your life's work. Always work to learn, always keep learning. They'll tell you now, new studies are it's good for your brain, it's good for your mood. Always work to learn more.
and it's the other part, and Kelly and I talked about this, is that with cancel culture, close by that we all feel, it has become. If we're not careful, we'll lose the history of our country. And people like a Pat Garrett, or everybody knows Billy the Kid, but very few people know Pat Garrett. And but so if we do not record it, if we do not write about it, it'll be lost and forgotten about. And so I appreciate you, Kelly, doing this work and doing the preservation of that, and the work that you do with the local historical society there. So important. And I appreciate you taking the time and interest to learn a little bit about Pat Garrett.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. And have a wonderful rest of the day because this has just been a wonderful, uplifting experience. Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome. Thank you.